of time and eternity. Help us to learn to look to the past with gratitude and to the future with hope. We remember this day those who have gone before us here, who labored not for themselves alone, but with a vision of building for the future a world better than they had known. Inspire in us also a like vision, that we too may labor for things beyond ourselves, that our lives may be dedicated to high purposes and grand horizons. Make us unafraid of naive hopes and dreams. Release us from cynicism and despair. Teach us to be realistic about our limitations, but never to lose hope in our potential to transcend them. Amen.
Our reading today is from the UUA 2019 Statement of Conscience, Democracy Uncorrupted. As a people of faith, committed to the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, we must continuously strive toward uncorrupted democracy. As a means to an end, democracy organizes decision-making among diverse people and preserves stability while balancing competing interests. But democracy is not merely a means. It is an end in itself, an ethical ideal, a moral and spiritual way of relating to one another. Sadly, many of our democratic institutions have been corrupted into being merely a means for giving powerful interests the appearance of legitimacy. The promise of democracy is for a life that fashions us as the people we want to be. Terry Tempest Williams calls us to be resolute and courageous in our trust. Quote, can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just our minds, and offer attention rather than our opinions? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up, ever trusting our fellow citizens to join with us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy? Democracy is not only a series of rules and systems, it is the culture and commitments of the people and of those entrusted with carrying out the will of the people. A truly democratic culture requires transparency and radical inclusivity, intentional deep listening, attending to the concerns of the most vulnerable, and caring about inclusion and exclusion. Cooperation, multipartisanship, and decision-making through consensus building. Accountability and accessibility, being responsive to the public good versus special interests. Public officials being held to a high standard of ethical and fiduciary responsibility. And finally, respecting and defending the rights and needs of those in the minority.
I probably don't have to. That is how many times in my 20 years of ministry I have completely abandoned my sermon scheduled for that Sunday and started over from scratch midweek. The three are 9/11, the Sunday after Sandy Hook massacre, and today. It is an understatement to say that what happened 4 days ago merits special comment. A deadly protest turned riot stormed the Capitol building that houses the United States Congress. It was inspired and motivated to do so by the President of the United States of America because he couldn't handle losing a fair and free election. That sounds like something out of a foreign land in a foreign time, but here it is in modern America. Ironically, it occurred on a sacred holiday, the Feast of the Epiphany. January 6th is 12 days after Christmas, in which tradition teaches that it took the Magi that long to finally find Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. In many countries, particularly in Central and South America, gifts are exchanged on January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, and not Christmas. It's a holiday about gifts. The word epiphany means to encounter God or to encounter the holy in all of its awesome majesty. And in modern usage, epiphany also means to have a sudden insight or realization. I remember once listening to the radio. I think it was one of those sports call-in shows. And a man called in, talked about his daughter playing softball. He was upset because his daughter's team had lost a game that was very important to them. And this father had to endure what most of us parents hate to endure, but inevitably must, witnessing our child in pain and not being able to do anything about it. He heard his daughter crying and grieving the loss of this game. He got more motivated to encourage her to train and to win. I always want her to win, he said. I never want her to have to experience the pain of losing. I've thought a lot about that conversation since, particularly the role of parents in educating our kids on how to lose. Obviously, no one wants their kid to be sad or upset. I completely understand this dad's feeling. And yet I wonder if there is a teachable moment being missed here. What if learning to lose is just as important and maybe more important than winning all of the time? It's more realistic to expect the softball team to lose some games. The question isn't how do we avoid losing, but rather how do we cope with losing when it happens? I think sports in particular have an opportunity to teach kids and maybe adults resilience and persistence in the face of losing. It shows them how to bounce back, to keep at it, to manage our expectations, and to have it fuel the desire to be better and get better in the future. Too often, we simply avoid the pain of having lost, and by doing so, we fail to learn the lessons that the emotional and spiritual lessons losing can teach us. I share this because one of the things that strikes me about this past week's events is that it is a contrast in how to lose something. In 2016, when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost in the Electoral College, many on the left were clearly upset. I probably don't need to tell you why. The reaction was that people were sad and they cried. They cried openly, expressing their grief in an attempt to process it. At the time, the right was critical, calling people snowflakes and crybabies. You lost, get over it, was the slogan at the time. Well, my parents taught me never gloat, because 4 years later, the shoe was on the other foot. Faced with a significant defeat in both the popular vote and the Electoral College, Trump's response has been denial. Denial of what happened, and until very recently, denial of what will happen on the 20th. He listens to, and presumably believes, stories about himself as a glorious leader whose will is omnipotent. Having never truly been held accountable, he is incapable of holding himself accountable. And thus it goes beyond the denial of facts to delusion about reality itself. That is to say, what is fact and what is clearly fiction does not seem to be discernible to Mr. Trump or his supporters. That is to live in a world unlike our own. That is the territory not of politics, but of religion. Trump and his supporters sadly live in this cult of personality and mistake it for our own. And with denial and delusion comes a third D, destruction. Inevitably, things erupted into violence and destruction of one of the sanctums of democracy. It also appears to be the destruction of the Republican Party, which now faces a serious divide between Trump's supporters and the mainstream. It cannot be overlooked that people lost their lives in this attack. It sounds like something the Nazi Party would have done in the lead up to Hitler's reign. And I do not invoke the Nazis often because I think it is usually a cheap reference. However, it is now painfully clear that the threat to our democracy, including the violent treatment of our leaders, rises to the level in which such a comparison is apt. Unitarian Universalism is a faith in which democracy is central. Just to kind of refresh our memories for a moment, the fifth of our 7 and hopefully soon to be 8 principles is about democracy. It reads, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. We heard from the 2019 Statement of Conscience that democracy is not merely our governance system. The values of democracy are the values of Unitarian Universalism itself: freedom, reason, equality, peace, regard for the common good, respect for the individual. A. Powell Davies was a minister in Washington, D.C., actually. And in the 1950s, he argued against communism, but also for the left. He called Unitarian Universalism the democratic faith. That is how steeped we are in democracy. Now, there were a number of very anti-democratic things that happened on Wednesday. The very thought of replacing the votes of the entire nation is itself a violation of the principle of one person, one vote. And while there may at times be extreme or extraordinary reasons for questioning votes, those reasons can't be fictional. Such moments require clear evidence, not merely the desire for victory. This whole fiasco has revealed how very plainly what has always been suspected, that Donald Trump cares not one whit for the public good, including the good of his cult-like supporters. He cares only for the preservation and expansion of his personal wealth and power. And while he is not likely to be alone in that ambition, he clearly has been the most brazen and unapologetic in bringing it about. The man is only ever about himself, always has been, and always will be. The other undemocratic aspect to Wednesday was the weak police response and perhaps even tolerance of the mob and its behavior. I'm sure you've seen the pictures of the police taking selfies and moving barricades to allow the crowd to get closer. People occupied those steps for hours. Contrast this to the actual peaceful protest by Black Lives Matter last summer, just blocks away. Those were met immediately by police in riot gear, tear gas to disperse the crowds, and brutal attacks. Thus, the systemic racism and privilege of white supremacy culture that still pervades our society was also on display. All of this raises the question that we have to ask ourselves, I think, as Americans. Who are we? We pride ourselves on being the oldest and greatest democracy on the earth. And while I would not dispute that we are the oldest, one now has to question whether we are the greatest. We allow fact to be confused with fiction in our media. We think of ourselves first before our neighbors and the common good for everyone, regardless of their race or other factors. We allow greedy economic policies that benefit a few to pass while most of us fight over what little is left. This tension then spills over from our politics into our personal identity until our political affiliations are one and the same with who we are. We allow politics to become our worldview in a way that religion used to be our worldview hundreds of years ago. What we are seeing is that our politics needs to be healed. That's not to say that every difference should be overlooked and ignored. Quite the opposite. Ignoring our differences because they are uncomfortable would be a little like the father who never wanted his daughter to lose a softball game. Sure, we understand wanting to avoid a painful argument, but that doesn't solve anything. What we need to do is learn how to lose. We need to learn how to have differences and yet stay in relationship with each other. And by we, I mean America as a whole, not merely one political party and not the other. Let me show you what I mean by learning how to lose well. Stacey Abrams knows how to lose well. She ran for statewide office in Georgia and lost a close election. She, as others had, heard reports in the African American community about voter suppression tactics. These are tricks to keep Black people away from voting, or makes it so hard to vote that they just give up trying. This has, unfortunately, a very long history in the South. Now, Stacey Abrams could have lost and been super bitter about it. It must have been awful to lose an election that close. And I can't say I know her internal emotional processing around that event, but we can extrapolate that after a time of being upset, Stacey got to work. And in the video from The Late Show, we hear about the fruits of those labors, the amount of money she raised, the voter turnout efforts that have been successful. What would become clear 24 hours later after this was aired was that the efforts produced results. She got mad and then got organized. She addressed some of those suppression tactics, and more Black folks voted than ever before. That's why you see Georgia go for Biden and flip both Senate seats to the Democrats. Stacey Abrams and Donald Trump. Both politicians who have lost elections. Both people who've had to deal with the emotional turmoil of having lost and then figure out what to do next. Trump chose denial, delusion, and destruction. He tried to follow in the footsteps of all the world dictators he seems to admire. Fortunately, the American democratic institutions have weathered this particular attack from within. However, we have to ask, how many potshots can we take at those democratic institutions before the damage is too much and they fail us in our most desperate hour? Stacey Abrams went a different direction. In many ways, she did what a lot of us on the left have been doing for 4 years. She figured out a way to transform negative emotions into positive actions. When we're mad about the results of an unfair election and what we feel is an illegitimate president, then there were pink hats and peaceful protests all throughout the land. When our icons like John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg die, we use our grief to further their legacy. Our anger gets transmuted into passion. Our confusion turns into clear vision. How many conversations have we had about gender and race identity and women's consent? The progress is slow, but we have been trying to educate ourselves out of that confusion. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a teaching that our negative emotions can become the foundation for our virtues. That this transformation of anger into love is a spiritual one. We transform outrage into caring for people who look different than I do. That's the way we make compassion real in the world. Stacey Abrams embodies this. She's the bodhisattva of taking disappointment and transforming it into passion and then into thoughtful and effective organizing. That organizing is what gave her the payoff of flipping 2 Senate seats. 2 very different approaches to losing, Donald Trump and Stacey Abrams. Ironic that they both bore fruit on exactly the same day at the same time. Trump's delusion led to a presidential sanction of an insurgency. Abrams' wisdom and passion led to organizing and fundraising, which in turn addressed the very problem she faced herself in not winning office. Her candidates won, period. They probably would not have done so without her vision and hard work. Surely this is going to be the Democrats' template for every state with a significant African American population going forward. Stacey Abrams showed us how to live by a democratic faith. Needless to say, Donald Trump did not. Strange that both of their political lives took a decidedly different turn on January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany. Epiphany, as in receiving a gift unexpectedly from someone. That gift must surely be the US Senate for the Democrats. Epiphany, as in coming to a new insight or idea. Many Republicans had that moment. Can't say that I've ever liked a speech Lindsey Graham's ever given until Wednesday. He spoke it very eloquently about his epiphany regarding our president. Epiphany, as in encountering the holy. If you talk to people who are part of AA, they'll tell stories about hitting rock bottom, that moment that they found God not at the top of the mountain, but at the bottom of a bottle. Perhaps, and this is my prayer, that Wednesday was our rock bottom. That moment when enough was finally enough, as Senator Graham put it. I'm glad to hear he saw it that way. May God bless America. Not in the slogan-y way we normally say that, but more like a desperate prayer. We need blessings. We need healing that is more than physical. The soul of our nation is sick, and it will take each and every one of us to help make it better. Our leaders have an important role, of course, but all of us can do something to heal the broken, clothe the naked, take care of each other. We can also take care of ourselves by paying attention to our anger, our sadness, our temptation to give up hope. We need to continue to find ways to transform these negative emotions into acts of compassion and love. We have just all taken a 4-year course on how to endure and be resilient. Now is the time to see what we have really learned. With power comes great responsibility. So one of the blessings I will pray for is that wisdom and compassion be among the gifts received by our nation's new leaders. May it be so. I love you all. Go in peace, and amen.